So we'll just go ahead and get started, and if the people can make it in, that's great, and if not, then they can just watch the recording. So first, I want to start out by thanking you for your time. It was very funny. So I sent Diane, how do you pronounce her last name from Black?
Gettle.
Diane Gettle a note, and I guess she sent it out to her writers, and right after, it seems like right after I sent it to her, I heard back from you, and which I was like, oh, that's wonderful. And I'm looking at your name, and I'm thinking, wow, it's a very familiar name for some reason. So so I went right to your link, and I was like, oh my God, I love the documentary about you.
Goodness. That
was just a wonderful, wonderful piece about you. So, I mean, I feel like I have to start by asking, how did that come about?
Sure. So John Stahl, and I should emphasize, people always say they like my documentary. I'm just the subject. John Stahl, who's a lovely guy, did all the work. It's his documentary.
Yeah.
I went to Hebrew school with him as a very, very little kid. And I will confess, I barely remembered him when he contacted me. I said, oh, yeah, I know that name. He was a nice guy. And he said he wanted to make a documentary. And I figured that was going to involve maybe 5 hours. He would film me a few times at the hospital. But it was sort of like how you cook a frog. If you put it in hot water, it jumps out. Or if you put it in and slowly turn the temperature up, suddenly something like 130 hours later. But it went well. I mean, I will also confess I was entirely unprepared for the volume of people who saw it.
Really?
I figured maybe 500 people would see it, maybe 1,000 people would see it. My understanding is that several million people have now seen it. There was a point, the only upside of COVID is I no longer have to go to restaurants and people walk up to me and say, you're the guy from the documentary. It's happening literally 3 or 4 times a week.
That is so funny.
I now have over 100 love letters from strangers.
Oh, that's fantastic.
It's very sweet. I don't know how to answer them.
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe you have to hire an assistant to go through them all. That's really funny. So when was that documentary? When did they make it? I forgot to look at the year.
Oh, so he started it, I'm guessing, I want to say about 5 years ago, and he filmed it intermittently over a number of years, and then it came out maybe 1.5 years ago.
Oh, it did? Oh, okay, then I saw it relatively soon after it came out. Okay, so it's not that old.
It's not that old.
Wow. How did it feel when you sat down and watched it? I'm assuming have you watched it in its entirety?
I have watched portions of it. It's one of the challenges of it is I am not in love with the very close friend who's in the movie, who that is sort of the perception of. When he made the movie, I was actually dating a colleague, and we did not want him to know that.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, we never thought that millions of people would see this, so it seemed like a nice, harmless deception.
That is so funny. That's a riot. Rosalie is the one that everybody assumed was your love interest, right?
And Rosie, who is happily with someone else in life who I very much like. I mean, she's been my best friend for 25 years. I haven't dated her since she was in college.
That is so funny. So just as a quick background, just to kind of get the basic stuff out of the way. You said you're born and raised in New York City, correct?
I was born in New York City, raised in the suburbs, and then came back here about 25 years ago.
Did you go back for CUNY? Was that what brought you back to the city?
So I came back. So I was an undergrad at Brown, and then I did a combined PhD JD program at Columbia and Harvard. And the Columbia part was what I moved in here and never left.
And you went to CUNY as well, right?
So I did a playwriting degree at Queens College, but that was later.
Oh, okay.
So that's after I was already a physician.
Okay. Wow.
That was while I was a resident in psychiatry. I tell people anybody who's a doctor should do something else creative when they have any spare time. And my creative work was a playwriting degree at CUNY, which was fantastic.
Wow. Did when you were doing that, did you work with any theaters in New York? When was that
Yeah,
part of your degree?
I was going to say I am not the world's greatest playwright. I'll be the first to acknowledge that. But a handful of small theaters put up plays. My best experience by far, I had a play up at Detroit Rep right afterwards that
Okay.
was fairly well received, and that's about as if you make it in Detroit, you can make it anywhere, as they say.
Yeah, that's what they say. Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. I know that like Playwrights Horizons had like a playwriters workshop and some other smaller theaters like that. I wasn't sure if there was any overlap with the MFA program at CUNY, but it doesn't really sound like it.
I don't think there was then. There may be now. I think when I went to Queens, when I went to CUNY, it was just starting up as a program, and it has since really flourished. So
yeah, I went to the New School, and then after I graduated from the New School, I decided I want to be an actor. So I went to the American Academy of Dramatic Art, and then years after that, the New School got together with the Actors Studio. So if I just waited a few more years, I wouldn't have had to do all that jumping around. Could have done it all right at the New School. But it seems like there's there's a lot of that going around where smaller studios are getting picked up by some of the bigger institutions, which actually I think is a pretty good fit. It offers the students a lot of options. Did you? I know a couple of doctors who studied fine art types of things. I can't say I know a lot though. Did you find that there were doctors that were doing that kind of thing, where they were working on fine arts degrees or had a fine arts sort of strand that they were pursuing on some level?
Well, I think there are a lot of doctors out there who aspire to do something creative one way or another, and I know that because I run a writing program for doctors now at Mount Sinai.
Oh, no kidding.
And I get lots of people contacting me about opportunities, the medical students, the residents. So there's a lot of interest. I think one of the challenges is the volume of patient care and work people have, but the other is also it's never been part of their formal trajectory. Unfortunately, one of the downsides about how we train doctors is we expect them to learn organic chemistry and focus on medicine at an early age. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. I mean, as a former professor of mine said, he wouldn't want a doctor who hadn't read Macbeth. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. You want people who understand the world broadly, and yet the system we use to train them forces you to see the world narrowly.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a doctor that worked on my wife's ear. There's a gentleman named Dr. Lim. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He's an ear specialist. He also happens to be a musician, and he did some studies about, I think, jazz improvisation and what your mind does while you're improvising, while So he actually had jazz musicians in an MRI, and he was watching their brainwaves as they were playing their instruments. It was wild. I think he was, she'll have to chime in at some point, but I think he was at Hopkins. But I thought that was really, really interesting that, the kinds of things that like a guy like that has those types of interests that you're talking about would be able to bring the two together and to really take it to a whole other level. I thought that was just fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, we want doctors who don't forget what they know as human beings.
Yeah.
And in order to achieve that, having people who are trying to convey what they know with other media is really a valuable thing, I think. It makes them both better doctors, and their doctorate makes them better writers. So
right. That's interesting. So so you did your playwrights degree. What year was that about?
That's about 2012.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's more recently. So I can tell you in terms of background, I never thought I was going to be a doctor. In third grade, we had to make a poster for our career choice, and my career choice was not a doctor. And I made a whole poster about not being a doctor. And when my third grade teacher told me that was unacceptable, I went home and redid it and made a poster that was not a psychiatrist. And now I'm a psychiatrist. I should add, my mother's father had run the Army's facility for the criminally insane in Santa Fe, New Mexico during World War II. And the stories I heard, including how he would do shock therapy on his dining room table, did not make me long for a career in psychiatry. So wow. I came at it very circuitously. I wanted to be a bioethicist and write about the shortcomings and challenges of medicine, and somehow they brought me over to the other side.
That's wild. So, so when did you start submitting your creative writing pieces for publications?
Well, I think I didn't start writing seriously until law school, which was probably about 1990. 1996.
Okay.
What I tell people is, if you have gone to law school and you have any common sense, you'll have considered another career while you're there. And mine was writing, and it helped me survive the 3 years. And then maybe in 1998, I started sending out work, and I got lots of rejections. I believe when I stopped counting, I was at about 22,000 rejection letters.
Really?
Yeah. I used to have my walls plastered with them, but I was dating someone and she thought they were a fire hazard. And she said either the rejection letters came down or she left. And in the long run, they both left, but the letters left first.
That's fantastic. Jake, like, why would you continue to submit after that many rejections? Like, what keeps you going at that point?
Probably, I am a psychiatrist by training, so my answer to any question like that is a deep-seated feeling of inadequacy generated in early childhood.
Amazing.
But then again, if I win the Nobel Prize, I would still have a deep-seated feeling of inadequacy generated in early childhood. So.
Oh wow, that's amazing. So I only read. I mean, I feel like you sent me your this set of books. I think there's 6 of them here. But this isn't even all the things that you've published for creative writing, right? I mean, this is just a portion, correct?
So I have my 19th book comes out in September with Black Lawrence, Winter Honeymoon. I published slightly more than 200 stories, short stories, of which about half have been collected.
So you've published 200. How many? Do you have about the same amount that you've never published?
I think I don't have that many completed stories that I've never published, because I'm really of the theory that at some point writing a story you can figure it's not going to work, or it's going to work, and if it's going to work, you just keep submitting until it's published. And if it's not going to work, you just put it in a drawer, and that's the end of it. So I have hundreds of partially completed stories.
Talk me through that a little bit. I know when the members of the group watch this, I think that's definitely something that comes up a lot. When do you keep editing versus when do you just abandon ship or maybe use it for something else? Well, in terms of your process, how do you know that? Like if you're working on something and you decide, I'm not going to finish this.
Sure. And I will say more broadly, there's the danger of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, which a lot of people do. They write a really good story and they think it's not perfect and they put it in a drawer and never see the light of day with it. So you want to have some confidence. That being said, I would begin by saying you need to know when to start writing. It's Grace Paley used to say she did her best writing in the bathtub. And now my students think that means she brought her computer into the bathtub and almost electrocuted herself. But what she meant was that she thought through what she was going to do before she started. Right. And I do a lot of that. So when I sit down to write, I have a pretty good sense of the architecture of the story. Okay. And then it either comes together as something coherent or it doesn't. I know it's a very American notion that anything can be perfected. What I tell the students is if they're bright enough to reach the level where they're in the kind of class or workshop where they come to me, they can write a really good story. I'm sure of that. It doesn't mean that every story is a really good story. And one of the aspects of the art is figuring out which stories are good stories that they, even if perfected, will only reach a level of competence. And competence is a really good quality in a dentist and a really bad quality in a short story.
That's fantastic. So at what point do you abandon ship with the story? Like, is there something about it that just doesn't feel right? I know you're not going, and I totally get what you're saying. You're not going for perfection. What is it? Is it that you're losing the thread of the story, that you're just not able to create characters in the way that you thought you could create them?
I think a better way to think of it is I always start writing a story having a pretty good sense of the ending. Mm-hmm. So I know the trajectory. And at some point going through the story, the trajectory doesn't connect with the ending, I know I failed. And a lot of people, they try to contort the story to make it reach that ending, and then it doesn't feel organic.
Right. Do you, generally speaking, do you go into a story knowing that it's a short story, or do you just start to write and then let it go where it's going to go?
Oh, I definitely know it's a short story. And it's like I've published poems, I've published essays, I have a very good plays. I know exactly what genre, what length. The way I describe it is there are 2 ways of taking your kids on vacation. One way is you buy tickets to a particular destination, get a motel room, rent a car, and you have a really great weekend at Disney World. The other way is you get in a car and start driving. Anybody who's ever done that for more than a few minutes understands why it's a bad plan.
Yeah. I've done both. Yeah, I've done both. I understand. Um, yeah, that's funny. So, how many novels have you written?
I have written, I got to count, I believe 6,
Okay.
and my publisher is a 7th that has yet to be published.
Wow. Okay. I want to get into that in a minute, but before we get into that, I want to close out just a couple of things with the short stories. You said that you have, you always, you know where it's going. You have an end in sight. It sounds like you're working from some kind of an outline. Do you write out anything like an outline, or is it all kind of in your head?
It's all in my head, and what I emphasize to people, the best way to structure a story, obviously there are people who have their own methods that work great for them, but if you don't have a method in advance, structuring it by scenes, thinking out what are the 6 or 5 major scenes in my story, and using that as your architecture. If you don't write a story with an architecture of scenes, it feels told rather than shown.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I've never thought about that. Is that sort of the just kind of something that you've come up with in terms of the magic number of scenes in a short story, 5 or 6? Is that generally what you found works best for you?
Yeah, I tell people we like to think we're heirs to Locke and we're idealists, but we're actually heirs to Marx, whether we want to be or not. The driving factor in what makes a short story is how many pages are allotted. And if you're going to have a 3,000 to 6,000 word story, you're going to get about 5 to 6 scenes. I mean, there are ways of playing games where you can be Donald Barthelme or John Barth and get 15 scenes in a 6,000 word story, but then you're pushing the envelope and doing something different.
Yeah, that's funny. Do you think it's different for plays?
I think the material constraints are even stronger for plays. And I think you particularly see that now with the condensed play where audiences' attention spans have gotten shorter and the traditional, forget 5-act play, 2-act play with an intermission is evaporating. And now you come for 85 minutes of theater and you pay your $150 a ticket to hear someone else's hearing aid. It's really a remarkable racket. But
yeah, but I'm even thinking of waiting for Godot. I don't know how many scenes technically it is. An awful lot of it takes place in the same exact spot. Not that you can't have different scenes that take place in the same spot, but I think about a play like that, which really is in a very confined space.
Yeah. And to his credit, I don't think Beckett was interested in the material constraints of how many actors he needed to hire. But I think increasingly, theater is driven by how many people they can put in the union contract and how many times they can change the set. And the idea, and candidly, the amount of money you make from your play is generated in large part by how many public high schools put it on and pay you a royalty check. So having a play that involves the right clientele matters.
Right. That's interesting. So, so one last question, and my phone's been blowing up. For whatever reason, members of the writers group aren't able to get in, and I know that's going to be upsetting to them because there's so many of them that write short stories.
I will come back if they want me to.
That would be wonderful. I'm absolutely sure they would love that. I hate to put you on the spot and I don't want to embarrass you, but you are a master of writing opening sentences. I love your, I'm going to read a couple. I was once briefly a suspect in a murder investigation. That's fantastic. What was the other one? I first heard the story of the alligator rodeo in 1924. Arlen's husband offers her a pair of clay elephants and tells her that he intends to marry another woman. These are the first sentences of your story. I love that. When do you write those? Do they come at the beginning of your process, or do they come at the end, or how does that happen? I mean, and is this something that you're aware of, or does it just sort of evolve?
They always occur at beginnings. You write the first scene first to get a feel for it. I want to see if I can find you my favorite opening line. It is my favorite opening. Here we go. So the opening of my story, Miracles and Conundrums of the Secondary Planets, and I hope your audience will forgive me for gloating, is my favorite. It begins, Siegfried and Mons Lentz did not have a name on his home planet because names were superfluous. But in Lemmings, Alabama, where he operated the Latvian restaurant opposite the abortion clinic, his regulars called him Red Ziggy. And the reason I like that is because it has a trajectory to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the best opening lines send the narrative in a particular direction.
Right.
Weak opening lines have too many directions you can go from. I'm blanking on the author, but there's a famous author who wrote a short story that begins something like, "I was pummeled as a teenager." And as I recall, that's because he took a workshop once where that was the suggested opening line. And he was very successful, but you can imagine all of the foul different trajectories that people took from that. So, I mean, you want opening lines that really send you only in one place.
So is that like for a story like, what was the first one I read? It was Canvassing. Was that actually the first sentence you wrote for the story Canvassing, or did that represent something that you wrote throughout the course of you writing the story and you chose to use that as your opening line?
Oh, no, it's always, I mean, I may revise substantially the rest of the story. I cannot think of any example where I've changed the opening line. The opening line defines the story. It stays.
Wow. Do you find that you write the opening line and then go with the story? Or do you already know where the story's going?
I already know where it's going, but I will probably spend half of the time before I start writing figuring out the opening line, because if the opening isn't right, you're on the wrong, even if you're only a little bit in the wrong direction. If you walk a few degrees off course for a block, you're not that far away, but for 1,000 miles, you're in the wrong place.
That's incredible. Wow. Do you find that you edit your stories a lot?
I do about, I would say 90% of my editing, my real like structural editing in my head. So when I sit down to write, I have a very good sense of the story, the scenes, the details. And then I do a lot of line editing, but that's sort of a slower, more lugubrious process over months. So
you're not like cutting out paragraphs and things like that. You've already kind of worked out a lot of that stuff in your head.
Yeah.
That being said, Jacob, how long do you let a story sit in your head before you write it down? Does it usually take a little bit of time? I would say when I'm actively writing, meaning when I'm sort of engaged in a project, it takes 2 weeks to a month to figure the story out in my mind, and then probably another 2-3 weeks to write it. Do you find that it comes out pretty quickly because you've worked so many things out? Oh yeah, no, I'm a physician the rest of my life, so my schedule is erratic. If I could simply sit down and write, I could probably write the story in 4 days, having spent a month thinking about it. Yeah. Do you find, this is something I've been thinking about since we've been in quarantine, do you think that if you had more time, you'd be able to write more, or do you think that there's a certain lifespan of a story that it, regardless of whether you have time or not, it's going to take to write it? I might be able to write more, but it wouldn't be nearly as good. I think we have a limited number of good stories to tell, and it takes a certain amount of time to let them percolate. So no, I think a lot of people would tell you they need more time to write. I'm very unpersuaded by that. There are people whose lives are truly packed and have no way of extricating themselves. Most people, when they're thinking about writing, what they really mean is not that they don't have enough time to write, but they don't find themselves in a place psychologically to do the writing when they have the time. Yeah. How do you have a time and place that you like to write? I do almost all of my writing at home. I used to do a lot of writing at the hospital, and then a particular incident reminded me why that was a bad idea. This is true. I was a resident in the hospital, and I tell people, you go to the hospital, you see all these people working behind the desks in white coats. You think that they're all working on patient care. They're all writing their novels. But one day I find an abandoned unit somewhere quiet in the middle of nowhere up in the hospital, working on this is real, I'm working on my novel, and suddenly somebody calls a code on the patient nearby, and I'm the only doctor there. And suddenly I'm in the middle of a code, patient I know almost nothing about. And that was a lesson. Now I write at home. That's probably good. That's, for so many reasons. Yeah. One, it's not as distracting, and, so that's good. That's funny. So when you finish writing your short stories, when do you know that they go together in a collection? Is that something that happens much later, or that's like much later? And the truth is, I have Dan and a number of other editors to thank for that.
I initially sold Diane 5 collections, but at the end of the day, I basically sold her 50 stories, and they were reassorted into collections where they worked well.
Right.
And I think it is an editor's skill to figure out which stories go where, much more than an author's skill.
So you didn't really do a lot of that curating yourself.
I am always amazed at the themes people find in the commonality of stories I've written in particular collections. People write to me and say, I love this collection, and it was about this. And then that collection I didn't like as much because it was about that. I think by far the best, though, a class in Malaysia read one of my story collections, and the students, several of them wrote me emails appreciative of how I had captured the parables and certain hadiths in the Quran, which was clearly not my intent at all. But they'd gotten this Quranic interpretation of my stories. It was fascinating.
That's funny. Well, I definitely did see some themes and some similarities. I mean, there were definitely pieces and amazing things that were different than Einstein's house. I mean, I really did feel like whoever chose those stories, I felt like them. I didn't sit with them long enough to say that, you know, what the themes were. I'm sure somebody could, but there's definitely tonal differences in the stories, and I could see why certain pieces weren't put, you know, together. Not that they wouldn't have worked together, but there were definitely, like, I did see certain themes in these that seemed to be very consistent. I think in Einstein's Beach House, seemed like there was a lot of death in that. Did you see that?
I mean, the short answer is there's probably a lot of death in most of my stories.
Yeah, right. It's not something you shy away from. That's definitely true. Yeah.
I mean, the two things that interest me are medical care, which I do for a living, and the girls who wouldn't date me in high school, and how to psychologically overcome that. So I've read a lot of stories about death, and a lot of stories about unrequited love from 16-year-olds.
Yeah. That's pretty funny.
I mean, I am still in touch with the girl who broke my heart at 15, by the way, who's a lovely person. And what I tell people is, actually, she might have been 16 by then. I write all of my stories for her, but not for the person she is now, for the person she was at 16, who no longer exists.
That's great. So there's no one you're writing stories for now?
No one I'm writing stories for now. That's actually not true. There's one exception. I did write a Jewish mystery novel, Rabbi Koppelmacher Accepts a Challenge, because my late grandmother only read large print Jewish mystery novels, and I wanted her to read something I wrote while she was living.
That's really funny. You touch on Judaism in a couple of the stories. I know there was it Caesarea to Antwerp? There was a lot of Judaism in that. That was the one with the female rabbi, right? So there were definitely, I mean, I definitely saw some religion in the stories. Is that something that you find yourself wanting to write about as you sort of come to terms with your faith and your understanding and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, I should emphasize, I am the world's least religious person.
Right.
Yeah. And with that context, I grew up in a family where there was a lot of tradition and a lot of relatives who passed away in the Holocaust, which sort of shaped the ethos of our home. Right. My grandfather was a refugee from Belgium, so I'm still grappling with it. Sure. And I feel like you never really get past it. And I mean, I was on a panel for Jewish writers at AWP last year, or I guess 2 years ago now, and I sort of like looked around thinking, how did they find me? But maybe that is the Jewish narrative. Right. It's both insider and outsider.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way of putting it. Do you want to? Is it something that you think you're going to write more about? Like, do you have? Like, I guess this question sort of presupposes that you have things in your mind that you're trying to work out, and the way you're doing it is through your writing. Is that a fair assessment?
As a psychiatrist, the answer is absolutely. But it all occurs at such a deep subconscious level that I'll never know it. Yeah.
Do you feel compelled to write about more about religion?
I mean, it's what I know. I mean, I think I think people actually, they read what they know or what they don't know. And the short, you should write about what you know about that other people don't know about. And you can either
Right.
do that by learning about it or by having it naturally be your experience.
Right.
So some things I've written about, I know nothing about. I wrote a short story about a Turkish locksmith. I know nothing about locksmiths. My first novel, The Man Who Wouldn't Stand Up, is about a botanist. My knowledge of botany is yay deep. There was this painful moment on British television where the caption and the interviewer did not realize the character was an American botanist. They thought I was an American botanist. And I
Were they
think
asking you botany questions?
They asked me how I became interested in botany, and I had to sort of politely swing through that.
Did you have to clarify that you're not, but your character is?
I figured like live television was not the moment to do that. I do, and I hope there are no Finnish Americans listening, but if they are, they will have to bear with this. And in all candor, Finnish Americans are not a group historically that faces large levels of discrimination in the United States, at least recently, so I feel I can say this. We were discussing several years ago what experience one could write about that truly wasn't co-opting anybody else's experience because there was just very little American literature about it. And someone says, well, there are no Finnish American contemporary stories. So I wrote one called The Frying Fin that appeared in Agni. And periodically over the years, people have written to me talking about how it's so good to find another Finnish American writer or the like. I am not remotely Finnish. I feel very guilty in hindsight.
Fantastic. I can't wait till you're invited to do a panel for that. It's going to be awesome.
I was once asked, I won't name the organization, but to speak at a Finnish-related group. I had to politely turn them down.
Why? You should have done it. That would have been great. That's very cool. So I want to transition now. I want to talk just a little bit about your novel. The only one I have in front of me is Surrendering Appomattox. So this one is this is CNR Press, and this was from 2019. Why is this one not with a press that you would, well, I shouldn't assume that. Had you worked with CNR Press before?
Never.
Okay.
This is my agent worked it out with them, but I think the short answer is it's a satiric novel about Civil War deniers. Yeah. And a lot of people, a lot of major publishers did not clearly feel very comfortable with the content.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah. I mean, that was my strong impression. That we can talk about whether it was a good enough book and the merits, but I think satire is certainly not on the in at the moment right now. My earlier satiric book generated some controversy and some not very positive controversy. My earlier book is about a man who refuses, called The Man Who Wouldn't Stand Up, about a man who refuses to stand up for the national anthem at a baseball game. Actually is caught sticking his tongue out and how his life falls apart as a result.
Well, that's interesting.
Long before the football protest, which was from 2011, 2012.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So I thought this book was hysterical. I've not finished reading it. I just started. I think it's hysterical. Laugh out loud funny. How did it do? Was it well received? Did it get reviewed? How would you say? Are you comfortable with?
The candid answer is you have single-handedly doubled my readership.
Really?
Yeah.
Why, Jacob? Why is that?
Luck, the flukes of the market. My plan is very Kafkaesque. I'm hoping I don't die of COVID, but I do work in a hospital full of COVID, and if I do, this is my career plan. Suddenly, people will take an interest. Don't burn my work. Whatever people tell you, don't burn my work.
I mean, it's always I never know how to ask certain questions, right? Like, what I want to ask is why aren't you more famous? Like, why aren't some of these books more popular than they are? And I know it's a complex question, but is there part of a machine, like a media machine that you have to be a part of to get this stuff out there, or what do you have any sense of how all that kind of stuff works?
Well, I think I probably need more vampires and zombies at the baseline. That certainly helps. But no, I think a lot of it is luck. I mean, clearly some people are very good at marketing themselves. Right. I am very good at providing psychiatric care in emergency rooms. Those are very different skill sets.
Sure.
And a lot of it is, I mean, there are many, many talented writers out there, probably many far more talented than I am, who get far less attention than I do. And what I often remind people, it's like, it's a weird thing to say, but whether my book is a success or not a success really doesn't change the course of Western civilization. The people doing the really hard work are changing linens in hospitals right now, and they never gain traction or become famous. And we should probably spend more time thinking about what they do and less time thinking about what I do is the real answer. But people don't like hearing that at writing groups.
No, I get that. I understand what you're saying. Yeah, you know, I've heard like musicians have said it for a long time. I think Flea said it. You know, if you're playing bass to get popular, you might as well give it up now. You know, you're doing this because you enjoy doing it and because this is your passion. And everything else is just everything else. I get that.
It's like in the Warren Late play Sideman, like When Will You Make It? He's made it. I mean, I have a book published by Simon & Schuster. I am a board member of the National Book Critics Circle. I'm doing an interview with you. I mean, what more could one ask for in life? When I was a kid, I mean, the idea of publishing a story was a surreal prospect to me.
Right. No,
and at
I
the opposite end of things, I imagine that Philip Roth would sit in his apartment all day long, kicking himself, thinking, "I'm not Toni Morrison," over and over again. And there's no upside to it once you take that mindset.
I'm sure that's true. So talk to me a little bit about like the process with the short story versus the novel, not just the writing process, but once the writing is done, the editing and the publishing. How different are those two? Because this is something that comes up a lot in our writers group as well. You know, trying to figure out, you know, submitting your stories for a journal versus submitting your manuscript, which you're not even submitting. You're submitting a chapter to an agent who's then going to represent you. How are those two processes different? And especially like for you, does that look different now, or do you have an agent that you've been working on for so long that you guys have a relationship?
I have an agent who I'm very close to, who I have a very good relationship with. She's my fourth agent. My previous agent, who was also very good, passed away. Like, life is unpredictable in that way.
Yeah.
That being said, what I tell people is the real thing they need to figure out for themselves is there are two different paths to publishing a book or building a career as a literary writer. One is to publish your first book with a major press, or try to, which is a big gamble because most books published by Random House or Simon & Schuster, they fail. And then it becomes harder to publish a second book. Or to publish a story collection with a small press, do the kinds of things that build you up a following, so that then when you go to an agent to sell your second, your third, or fourth book, you really have a base to build it upon. The more I've seen about writing careers, the more I think the second approach is the better one.
Interesting.
The people who do the due diligence, who do the hard work, for usually it takes 5 to 10 years to build those credentials, their first books do better because then they can, people will say, "Oh, I know that name," and they'll pick up that book, and they've done favors for people who are glad to write them a blurb or write them a review. I mean, when I first set out to get blurbs for my first book, I wrote to dozens of people, and I think I got 2 blurbs. And I will be candid, when I sent out for blurbs for my 17th book, I think I emailed 25 people, and 24 of them wrote back within a few days. And it's not that my writing got better; it's that the name recognition got better.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So what you were just saying about working with a big publisher versus a small one, does that go for both short stories and for novels? Is there a difference between the two in terms of who you want to publish with and the relationship with those?
I mean, in terms of, for stories, you do want to publish in more prestigious journals if you can, and we can debate about what those are. But in terms of publishing collections, I think it's the same principle. I think people should not lose sight of the fact that Black Lawrence, which is an amazing publisher, Diane takes a deep vested interest in every single book she publishes. And the big 5 publishing houses have a spring line of books and a fall line of books and a spring line of books again. And some of them also manufacture appliances in the Netherlands. So you are not their top priority. And I mean, what I tell people is, it takes, when the Pope dies, it takes 3 days for them to find a new Pope. They can find a new you or me pretty darn quickly. So the big houses, you are rather expendable.
So does your agent take care of most of the back end stuff when it comes to, like, you know, the relation, the you know, contracts with the publishers and all that stuff? I mean, do you provide much input, or is it like just a whole separate thing that just kind of runs somewhere else?
So I make her life difficult because, like, she does all the back end negotiating with large publishers and international rights and translation and, in theory, movies, film, all that. And then I make agreements with magazines that have circulations of 700 for excerpts of these books. I create enormous contractual problems because I am not in it for the money, and I don't really have any sense of any business skills at all. So some guy will write to me from Iran or Norway and say, I would love to do a Norwegian translation of your story. Can I? And I'll say, sure. I have the rights to the Norwegian translation. Who is this person? I mean, so I'm probably not representative in that way, which is a good point for me to mention. See, my goal is honestly to gain readership, which should be all of your writers' goals, not to gain market share or anything like that. So if anybody out there is interested, I sent you 3 copies in PDF of my most recent books. Either you should send them out to them or they can email me. I'm glad to send people PDFs of virtually any of my books they're interested in.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. That's very cool. What's your, and I'm not going to take up too much more of your time. What's your feeling about you know, social media and all that stuff? Do you have much of a social media presence?
I don't, in part because I'm a psychiatrist and that sort of gives me pause, and in part because I'm over the hill and my idea of technology is 2 paper cups and a string. But what I tell people is there's this myth, and it really is a myth, that in order to sell a book, market a book, you need to have a social media presence. For some people who already have social media skills, and this is something they're good at, that is a great tool to market your book. For other people who've never done this, learning how to do it for the sake of marketing your book is a mistake. That's not how you're going to sell books. It's figuring out what your particular skill set is. I sell, obviously now it's different with COVID, but historically I do a lot of book events and book festivals. I go to about 40 book festivals a year. I try to give as many talks, in-person appearances as possible. If anybody out there is a public library they want me to come talk at or Zoom in on, I'm always glad to do that. Having a couple of stock talks on subjects you know a lot about. So that's how I market books. That there is no royal road to geometry. There are many different ways to do this.
You seem to really enjoy this, though. I mean, this really seems to be something that you truly enjoy, talking to people and encouraging them and you know, keeping it going. Is that accurate? I mean,
Absolutely. I mean, someday one of my former students or maybe somebody I met in an event is going to give an acceptance speech in Stockholm, and they're going to forget to thank me. But deep in my heart, I will know they were thinking of me.
Absolutely. That's a great attitude to have. How so you've said the best thing to do is to try and get readership. How do you get readership? I mean, it's very difficult, it seems. You know, especially in this age of Instagram where everything is 30 seconds or less. What would you say is, you know, what are a couple of ways that you found to get readership? Is it awareness? Is it, you know, just going out there and trying to get to know people and get in front of them and talking to them, or, you know?
I mean, I think many people are penny wise and pound foolish when it comes to publishing and writing. There's sort of this deeply misguided notion that I work writing just the way somebody works manufacturing precision parts. I will never give my work away. You should give your work away to the degree you can afford to as much as possible. Every time I do a book event in the bookstore, I make a point of buying as many copies as I can afford of the book in the bookstore and giving them to the cashiers at the front desk, because they will be flattered that somebody bought them a book. They will probably at least read part of that book. And the next time someone asks them, can you recommend a book? It'll be the first book in their mind. So that is one of the many different tricks. I send free copies, PDF versions to anyone interested. People say, well, that'll take away market share. It doesn't. If you enjoy the book, you'll recommend it to someone. Eventually, somebody will buy one.
Right. No, absolutely. That's so funny. Wow. Well, I mean, I could just go on and on and on asking you questions. I think it's amazing to find somebody that has so much insight into so many different topics, and not the least of which is your writing. And I think it's just been incredibly valuable to hear a little bit more about your process and how you do it, and to hear somebody your caliber that's going through a lot of the same things as me and the other people in my writers group go through, just in terms of the creative process, and what you do with it afterwards and all that kind of stuff. So I really hope that we can continue this conversation at some point.
Oh, absolutely. Have me back anytime. I mean, particularly now that we're all living on Zoom, it's nice to actually engage other people who aren't psychotic, which is mostly what I spend all day doing.
Well, you don't know me. I might be.
It's a continuum.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a continuum. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Well, again, thank you very much. I truly appreciate your time. And
absolutely. I will, as a last farewell, I will just, my email, if people are interested, it's actually on my website as well, but it's my full name, Jacob M. Appel, no dots or dashes, at Gmail. If they have particular questions, concerns, they should feel free to write to me.
And I'll absolutely share that. We have a Facebook group. I'll make sure that everybody has all that information, and I would love to see other members of my group reach out to you individually so that they could talk to you and get some individual feedback.
Absolutely.
It's always hard to set up those dialogues, with writers. Talked about this before. We do, one of the things that we do as a group, I try and host at least one reading a year. So we go to there's a bar in the neighborhood where the writers group meets, and we do a reading there once a year, and it's usually a lot of fun, and everybody comes out, and it's just, writing's isolatory by nature. So it's really, it's a great thing to socialize with people that have a common interest. And we always just have a great time with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I will add, for future generations, if they're watching this, bars were public places people used to go to drink alcohol before the pandemic, just so they know.
I hate that. I have no idea what it's going to look like when we're all back out there. Yeah. The idea of being in a bar with a couple hundred people right now just seems so overwhelming to me. Yeah. And as a medical person, I'm sure it seems very foreign to you right now.
Not the ideal moment.
Yeah, nightmarish, some might say. Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
It's been my pleasure. All right. Stay well.
Okay. Be well. Bye-bye. I'll sign off.